I began my ministerial career as an intern in a semi-rural, semi-suburban Unitarian church in Wisconsin. Early on, I would just basically follow around the minister, trying to figure out how to be a minister. One Sunday after services, in part of the church building that many of you may not be familiar with, it's a place with mouse traps, where it's a little bit cooler in temperature, where the windows are on the very top of the walls, the church basement. There, the minister was leading a new member orientation class. The instructions were to move on one side of the room, depending on what theological stance you had on something, and on the other side. So, for instance, if you were an atheist, you went on this side. And if you were a theist, you went on this side. I went somewhere in the middle. One of the couples had a 7-year-old boy with them. Among all the shifting and moving, the boy yelled out to the minister, "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" Everyone stopped their theological positioning, froze, and listened. What was the minister going to say? She paused, knelt down by the boy. "Well, you see, I'm basically the main storyteller here." The boy nodded, understanding. So this story stayed with me for multiple reasons. Just the sheer kindness of the minister, relating the complex role of a minister to something a child could easily grasp, a storyteller. I also internalized something else, that my role as a minister was to weave together a narrative that everyone could relate to. Easier said than done. It's not a secret that children and adults all love a good story. We often understand the world through story. Stories position ourselves in this vast universe we live in. Through story, we can be put into someone else's high heels or boots, even though we're only used to wearing tennis shoes. A narrative can also unite us. Our brains have evolved and have the need and the hunger for story. Often religious leaders tell big stories, meta-narratives. But in this postmodern world we live in, the meta-narratives that held us together and oriented our ways are sometimes just no longer valid. The world seems too complex for one singular story. I was raised a good, pious, Bible-believing Christian. At the Christian school I attended, we were routinely instructed to black out with markers whole sections of the textbooks that mentioned the age of the universe or biological evolution. It was the Bible and its stories that we focused on. And the big story that encapsulated me the most was the 7-day creation account. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created the whole universe not out of nothing, but from God's self, or God's word. Not only was this an act of creativity, but an act of love, for God wanted life, i.e. us, to flourish. So creativity and love are divine attributes to mimic, as well as rest, just as God did on the seventh day, on Sabbath. Meta-narratives, they're everywhere. Sometimes oral, sometimes written down. The Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley also have big stories and meta-narratives. The story of emergence engulfed me and became real while going down the stairs at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center here in Albuquerque. There are many variations depending on which Pueblo people are telling it, but there seems to be somewhat of a consistency. The first humans emerged out of the earth. The place of emergence sometimes is an actual place, not necessarily the ground. For example, the Blue Lake up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains is where the Taos Pueblo people emerged. In the Zuni emergence story, people initially dwelt crowded tightly together in total darkness in a place deep in the earth known as the Fourth World. So then going down into the kiva and emerging again is a rebirth ritual. Coming from the earth makes the earth sacred. A care for it, then, is of the utmost concern. Now, the Western world has also incorporated many political and / religious grand stories into our consciousness. Marxism, that history is moving toward revolution and ultimately utopia. Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains. There's the myth of progress, that we are moving socially and technologically onward and upward forever. That was a story we like to boldly tell before the horrors of World War II. Then there is the American story with themes of freedom, exceptionalism, that we are unusually great, that anyone can achieve the American dream, whatever that is, I'm not sure, if we what? Work hard, if we just work hard. Now, these types of stories, they unify people, they unify us. But we Unitarian Universalists, do we really have one accepted large-scale story? Do we? What is a UU storyteller to tell? There is one theme that I have noticed in our Unitarian Universalist history, and it gets celebrated a lot. It's the individual thinker that sticks to his or her theological position on one side of the room, suffers for it, but later gets credit for being a great reformer. We claim folks like Origen, who stood up for universal salvation, but then was deemed a heretic. Miguel Servetus, the Spanish theologian / medical doctor, who wrote a book called On the Errors of the Trinity, and was then burned at the stake for it. Or Ralph Waldo Emerson, who stood up to the corpse-cold Unitarianism of his time and wanted more direct experiences of the divine and ended up quitting the ministry to search for it. These hero stories may inspire may inspire tolerance and intellectual freedom, but I don't know if they are exactly meta-narratives that everyone can latch onto and understand. In my time here at First Unitarian, I've heard stories with common themes of boldness and a willingness to innovate. We were one of the first UU churches to have a website. We were one of the first churches to have branches. Let's say hello to Carlsbad. Hello, Carlsbad. Let's say hello to Socorro. Hello, Socorro. Let's say hello, East Mountains. Hello, East Mountains. I'm waving into the camera at them. We were one of the first UU churches to have a contemporary music worship service. We were something like $250,000 short on funding this sanctuary when you all had the audacity and boldness to have a miracle Sunday. You even exceeded your goals. These stories give us an identity. Telling our community stories unite us. and they help us along. They help us along in our faith formation, our process of meaning making. The truly religious life is also about telling our own personal stories. That is why small group ministries like Covenant Circles and Theology on Tap are so powerful. We get the chance to tell our own innermost spiritual stories in a safe place. In the telling of our own narratives, we may notice the repeating themes and repeating patterns, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes in between. But these patterns and reoccurring stories make us who we are. And we honor each one's individual journeys. I was in a covenant circle a number of years ago back in Milwaukee, and one of the members of that circle told how he was staying with a friend in an old farmhouse. The old farmhouse was once a stop on the Underground Railroad, and in the middle of the night, he awoke and saw a ghost, a black man in chains. Now, initially, I was very skeptical of this, but the way he told the story, I am convinced to this day he saw a ghost. I want you to look at the person next to you and say, I have a story. I have a story. I want to look at the person next to you and say, I have a story and I'm going to tell it. I have a story and I'm going to tell it. So, in some of our most needy times in life, it's the telling of our own story that keeps us whole. In my short ministry with the grieving, I quickly realized that I'm not the main storyteller, I'm the main listener. Stories emerge in our darkest hours, and they give us a sense of meaning. Telling them gives us a sense of meaning. Poet and funeral director Thomas Lynch says that when people are trying to tell you what happened about someone dying, what they're giving you is a narrative. They're telling you their story. The story takes on repetitions, a rote characteristic, as if it were a prayer. He woke up in the middle of the night. He asked for a glass of water. I brought it to him. He took a sip, and there was this heave, and he was gone. Or as Nevada Verino recounts in a PBS documentary by the name of The Undertaking, I woke up to a sound. I could see him clearly because the moon was out, and when I looked at him, I could see that his breathing slowed. And I watched him take his last 3 breaths. And the hard part is, and I don't know, maybe it's the great part, is that everything inside of me, the mother in me, was just saying, go. It was time for him to go. The story I tell, that I tell like a prayer, was from 16 years ago when my cousin died. It was New Year's Day. I got a call at 6 a.m. from my sister. It's Timmy. You need to come to the hospital. You shouldn't drive. Dad will pick you up in 20 minutes. She held back tears, and I could almost feel the lump in her throat. In the car, my father wouldn't tell me what happened. The streets were stained with salt. I went into the hospital waiting room where my family was, the same hospital I was born at, faded, Monet prints on the wall. I was then led into a room with a stainless steel table on which the lifeless body of my cousin lay. A single white sheet covered him, and my other cousin, his brother, held Timmy's hand, tugging, crying, shaking his head. No, no, no. Telling our stories helps make sense of our lives. It brings an order to chaos. Now, I want you to look at the person next to you and say, "You have a story. You have a story, and I'm going to listen to it." Besides our personal and our communal stories and narratives, there is a grand narrative we could tell, we Unitarian Universalists, the universe story. It may be a bit abstract, it may be a bit heady, but it can be brought into our lives. We emerged out of a natural, creative, and destructive process 13.7 billion years in the making. Our whole universe came from a condensed particle smaller than a grain of sand. Quite hard to comprehend. There are billions of galaxies. The ones that are spiraling are actually birthing stars, while the ones that are more egg-shaped are slowly dying. Stars are continually being made and being formed. So like the Hebrew 7-day creation account, creativity is the calling of the universe. For humanity's whole existence, we've been looking up at the heavens and connecting our stories with them. Some thought the stars were gods, that we came from the stars. But do these giant balls of gas twinkling above us actually relate to us? Like us, they are born, they develop, they die. In fact, 5 billion years ago, our solar system emerged from death, from exploding stars. Elements floated around were eventually pulled into tiny balls of dust, and with the help of gravity, this stellar dust became planets. If Earth were bigger, we might be full of just gases. If we were smaller, we might just be solid rock. But we are in a creative planetary space, a Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. This zone puts our crust in motion, helping to create volcanoes, helping to create mountains, the mountains and volcanoes that surround us here. In fact, it is a bit of a wonderful mystery we are here at all. That we are able to dimly recognize our small place in this vast universe. Similar to the stars, the moon has inspired story after story, from the man in the moon in the west to the moon rabbit in the east. The moon is actually the ancient offspring of a violent collision of two planet-like bodies. So from single-celled organisms to polar bears, the Earth became an interconnected ball of life. And we emerged from the Earth, much like the Pueblo people have been telling us for centuries. Time is just a creative emergence, as it is in our lives. Like Ecclesiastes, the universe has a time to be born and a time to die, a time for hydrogen atoms, a time for bringing forth galaxies, a time for the earth to form, a time for life to emerge, a time to bring forth the human species, and a time for awareness of the universe. Turn to the person next to you and say, "We have a story." And now turn to the person next to you and say, "We have a story and we're going to tell it." Just as the death of a star, a solar system formed, an explosion of creativity can come seemingly from destructive forces. Our lives, our communities can form a sense of belonging and creativity from telling our own individual stories. These sacred stories that we recite like prayers, they give us meaning. In addition, through the universe story, we recognize our shared beginning and our shared future. Like the universe of which we are a part, we are becoming, we are unfolding. We all come from a common source and are guided by the same natural processes. We are people not just of Albuquerque, people not just of New Mexico, people not just of North America, but people of the universe. Amen. Blessed be.